In 14 minutes, over 1,000 people died. Not in war, not in an earthquake, in a routine voyage across the St. Lawrence River that became Canada's Titanic, May 29, 1914. The RMS Empress of Ireland, pride of Canadian Pacific's fleet, slips into fog so thick you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. Within minutes, a Norwegian coal ship would slice through her hull like a can opener through tin. 1,012 souls would perish in the frigid waters, more than the Titanic's third-class passengers, more than most modern cruise ships carry entirely. But how did a ship designed to survive anything short of a torpedo end up on the riverbed in less time than it takes to watch a TikTok compilation? The answer lies in a perfect storm of human error, technological limits, and 14 minutes of absolute chaos. Built in 1906 by Fairfield Shipbuilding in Glasgow, the Empress of Ireland was a floating city. At 167 meters long, imagine 2 NBA courts placed end to end, then multiply by 3. Her gross tonnage of 14,191 tons made her one of the largest vessels plying the North Atlantic routes. Canadian Pacific spared no expense. First-class passengers dined on Wedgwood china under crystal chandelier. The ship's musicians played Brahms in the music room while couples waltzed in the ballroom. She could carry 1,580 passengers across 3 classes, with a crew of 420. On this particular crossing, 1,477 people had boarded at Quebec City, among them 170 members of the Salvation Army, bound for a London Congress. 8-year-old Grace Hannigan, travelling with her family to visit relatives in Ireland. The ship's captain, Henry Kendall, a veteran of 15 years commanding Canadian Pacific vessels. Did you know? Captain Kendall had previously commanded the ship that captured the infamous Dr. Crip, the wife murderer who became the first criminal caught using wireless telegraphy. The route was routine Quebec to Liverpool, a journey the Empress had completed 96 times, without incident. But as they steamed down the St. Lawrence River toward the Atlantic, nature had other plans. What could possibly go wrong on such a calm spring evening? At 1:30 a.m., about 200 kilometers northeast of Quebec City, the Empress encountered what sailors call pea soup fog. Visibility dropped to 0. Think of the thickest London fog you've seen in movies, then triple it. Captain Kendall did what any experienced mariner would do. He reduced speed and began sounding the ship's whistle. One long blast followed by 2 short ones, the international signal for "I am proceeding under reduced visibility." But fog plays tricks on sound. What seems like a distant ship's horn might be dangerously close. What sounds like it's coming from the left might actually be approaching from the right. Meanwhile, the Norwegian coal ship SS Storstad, loaded with 11,000 tons of Nova Scotia coal, was making its way up. Captain Thomas Anderson heard the Empress's whistle signals, but misread their meaning entirely. In maritime law, when 2 ships approach each other head-on, both should alter course to starboard. Essentially, ships follow the same keep-right rule as cars. But in fog, with whistles echoing off the water, determining another ship's exact position becomes educated guesswork. At 1:55 a.m., the fog began to lift slightly. For a brief moment, both ships spotted each other's lights. They were less than a ship's length apart, about 150 meters. In nautical terms, that's practically touching. Captain Kendall ordered full astern, essentially slamming the brakes. The Storsted's engines were put to full ahead, attempting to cross the Empress's bow. But here's the thing about massive ships. They don't stop like cars. They don't even slow down like cars. It was already too late. At 1:55 a.m., the Storsted's reinforced bow, designed to break through ice, punched through the Empress's hull like a spear through parchment. The impact created a gash 14 feet wide and 25 feet deep. Imagine a hole the size of a small house torn in the ship's side. Within seconds, the St. Lawrence River began pouring into the Empress at a rate of thousands of gallons per minute. The ship immediately began to list. Sailors speak for leaning so steeply you can't walk straight without grabbing the walls. But here's where the nightmare truly began. Most passengers were asleep. No general alarm had been sounded. The ship's electrical system failed almost immediately, plunging most areas into darkness. Emergency lighting lasted mere minutes. Third-class passengers, housed in the lower decks closest to the breach, faced an impossible choice: navigate flooding corridors in complete darkness or remain in their cabins and drown. Many never made it to the boat deck. The Salvation Army group, bunked together in adjacent cabins, became heroes in their final moments. As water rushed in, they began singing hymns. 7 of the 8 band members perished, their instruments found weeks later in the wreckage. Did you know? The Salvation Army's bass drum was recovered from the wreck and is still displayed at their International Heritage Centre in London. The ship's severe list made launching lifeboats nearly impossible. As the Empress tilted further, boats on the high side swung inward, useless. Those on the low side crashed into the water or were swamped before they could be properly loaded. Chief Engineer William Sampson remained at his post, keeping the boilers running to maintain electrical power as long as possible. He went down with his ship, ensuring others had precious extra minutes to escape. At 2:09 a.m., exactly 14 minutes after impact, the RMS Empress of Ireland rolled completely over and sank. The ship's whistle gave one final, haunting blast as she disappeared beneath the surface. Those still alive faced a new enemy. The St. Lawrence River in late May. Water temperature 4 degrees Celsius, cold enough to kill in minutes. Imagine jumping into an ice bath challenge, except it's pitch black. You're wearing heavy 1914 clothing, and there's no warm towel waiting. That's what over 400 people experienced when the Empress sank. At 4 degrees Celsius, the human body has roughly 15 minutes before hypothermia sets in. Your muscles seize up. Your coordination fails. You stop being able to help yourself. 80-year-old Grace Hunnigan found herself in the water after her lifeboat capsized. Her father managed to place her on an overturned lifeboat, but the weight of her water-soaked clothing kept pulling her under. A stranger, his name lost to history, held her up for nearly an hour until rescue arrived. God bless him. The Storstad, ironically, became the primary rescue vessel. Despite the damage to her bow, she remained afloat and immediately began pulling survivors from the water. Her crew worked frantically, hauling up anyone they could reach. Did you know the Storstad's crew saved 465 people that night? More than half of everyone who survived the disaster. The Canadian government steamer Lady Evelyn arrived within hours, along with several other vessels that had heard the distress calls, but by then, the window for survival was closing fast. Of the 1,477 people aboard the Empress, 1,012 perished. It remains the deadliest maritime disaster in Canadian history. More lives lost than the Titanic, in less than half the time. The survivors' stories would echo through maritime history. But first, someone had to answer for what happened that night. Within days of the disaster, the Canadian government launched a formal inquiry. The question wasn't whether someone was to blame, it was who. Captain Kendall testified that he had followed proper fog procedures, reducing speed and sounding regulation whistle signals. From his deposition, I was proceeding at dead slow speed, and I was giving the proper signals for a vessel proceeding in fog. But the Storstad's first officer, Alfred Toftines, told a different story. He claimed the Empress had changed course at the last moment, causing the collision. The Norwegian ship, he insisted, had been following proper navigation rules. The inquiry faced a classic he said situation. Both captains were experienced. Both claimed to have followed regulations. Both ships were properly equipped and maintained. The Canadian court ultimately ruled that the Storsted was at fault, citing improper navigation in fog conditions. The Norwegian ship was seized and sold to pay compensation to victims' families. But maritime experts remain divided. Some argue the Empress's sudden course change contributed to the disaster. Others maintain that the Storsted's failure to follow international fog protocols was the primary cause. Did you know the legal battle continued for years, with Norwegian authorities filing counterclaims against the Canadian government? The case set precedents for international maritime law that remain relevant today. Yet within weeks of the inquiry's conclusion, the world's attention shifted to a much larger catastrophe, and the Empress of Ireland began her long journey into historical obscurity. On June 28, 1914, exactly 1 month after the Empress sank, a Serbian nationalist shot Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo. Within weeks, Europe was at war. Canada's worst maritime disaster became a footnote to world history. The Great War dominated headlines for 4 years. Then, in 1915, the Lusitania was torpedoed off Ireland, killing 1,198 people. Unlike the Empress, the Lusitania's sinking had clear villains, German U-boats, and drew America toward the war. The Empress of Ireland gradually faded from public memory. No Hollywood films, no best-selling books, no unsinkable ship mythology, just 1,012 graves and a wreck lying 40 meters below the St. Lawrence River. The depth makes the Empress accessible to experienced divers. Unlike the Titanic's 3,800-meter grave, since the 1960s, thousands of divers have explored her remains, recovering artifacts and documenting the deterioration. But diving the Empress isn't a casual weekend activity. The St. Lawrence River's strong currents and cold temperatures have claimed several lives over the decades. The wreck has become a graveyard, guarding a graveyard. In 1999, the Canadian government declared the wreck a protected historic site. No more artifact removal. No more intrusive exploration. The Empress of Ireland finally received the respect she deserved, half a century too late. Did you know the Empress wreck contains more intact artifacts than the Titanic, including passenger luggage, ships, equipment, and personal effects still recognizable after 110 years underwater? But the ship's greatest legacy wasn't what went down with her, it was what came after. The Empress of Ireland's rapid sinking exposed fatal flaws in early 20th century ship design. Naval architects realized that watertight compartments meant nothing if the ship listed too severely to launch lifeboats. New regulations required ships to remain stable even with multiple compartments flooded. Watertight doors received emergency power systems. Lifeboat davits were redesigned to function at steep angles. Wireless telegraphy, still relatively new in 1914, became mandatory for all passenger vessels. The Empress's distress calls had saved hundreds of lives. Imagine the death toll without radio communication. The disaster also sparked changes in fog navigation procedures. Ships began using standardized whistle signals with precise timing intervals. International maritime law established clear right-of-way rules for vessels in reduced visibility. These reforms didn't prevent all maritime disasters, but they significantly reduced casualties. The Empress of Ireland's 1,012 deaths helped save thousands of future lives. In Canada, the disaster led to improved passenger ship inspection standards and mandatory safety drills. The country's merchant marine, previously loosely regulated, received comprehensive oversight. Did you know The life jacket design used on the Empress of Ireland was so ineffective that new regulations required all passenger vessels to carry modern, reliable flotation devices within 2 years of the disaster. The Maritime Museum of the Atlantic in Halifax now houses the most comprehensive collection of Empress of Ireland artifacts and survivor accounts. Their archive preserves the stories of those who lived and honors those who didn't. But over a century later, myths and misconceptions about the disaster persist. Time to separate fact from fiction. Internet forums love conspiracy theories, and the Empress of Ireland hasn't escaped the rumor mill. Let's debunk the most persistent myths with actual evidence. Myth: third-class passengers were locked in their compartments to prevent them from reaching the lifeboats. Fact: no evidence supports this claim. Third-class passengers had free access to upper decks. Their higher casualty rate resulted from being housed closer to the breach, not deliberate discrimination. Myth: the Storstead rammed the Empress intentionally as part of a German sabotage. Fact: the Storstead was Norwegian, not German. Captain Anderson's crew immediately began rescue operations. If sabotage was the goal, they would have fled the scene. Myth: the ship's band played Nearer My God to Thee as she sank, like on the Titanic. Fact: the Salvation Army group sang hymns, but there's no evidence they played this specific song. Survivor accounts mention religious songs, but don't identify specific titles. Myth: the disaster was covered up by the Canadian government because it happened so close to World War I. Fact: the inquiry was public, extensively covered by newspapers, and resulted in published findings. The disaster was overshadowed by the war, not suppressed. Did you know more people died on the Empress of Ireland than in the Great Chicago Fire, the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, and the Hindenburg disaster combined? These myths persist because the real story is complex. There were no clear heroes or villains, no dramatic final moments, no convenient explanations, just fog, human error, and 14 minutes of chaos that changed maritime history forever. Today, the RMS Empress of Ireland lies beneath 40 meters of St. Lawrence River water, her hull slowly returning to the earth. Fish swim through portholes where passengers once looked out at the Canadian countryside. Her decks, once alive with conversation and laughter, now host only silence. But the rusted steel still whispers from the riverbed. It speaks of the 170 Salvation Army members who died serving others, of 8-year-old Grace Hannigan who survived because a stranger held her up in freezing water, of Captain Kendall, who lived with the disaster for the rest of his life. The Empress of Ireland reminds us that tragedy doesn't need to be famous to be profound, that heroism doesn't require headlines, that every life lost in those 14 minutes mattered, whether history remembers them or not. From the St. Lawrence River to the world's oceans, their sacrifice made every voyage safer. The Empress of Ireland may be forgotten, but her legacy lives on in every life jacket, every safety drill, every ship that makes it safely to port. Subscribe below for more forgotten disasters that shaped our world.